All right. Good morning, everybody. So this is going to be the first lecture of how we're going to get about doing lectures for the foreseeable future as we are continuing our distance learning. This is topic 7.5, unresolved tensions after World War One. And I know that it seems a little out of order, but the reason I saved this topic is so much of the themes that we're coming to talk about is going to be related to what stuff we'll be covering in Unit 8, especially when it comes to decolonization. So for this one, the unresolved tensions after World War One, there are going to be some essential questions that you'll need to answer. Let me put me here. So these are questions that are going to be put onto an assignment that I would like you to respond to, just to show me that you have watched this and hopefully you understand this information. But to what extent did territorial holdings change following World War One? And identify and explain how the continuity in territorial holdings after World War One led to further tensions. So, think about those things as we're going through this lecture here right now. All right, so let's get some basic context here. So World War One, we talked a lot about the horrors of that war, the Great War, trench warfare, all of it and such. We tend to focus, especially here in America, on the Western Front, what occurred on in Western Europe. But this was a world war, and it involved, not just the great powers of the time, but also their colonial holdings. And so there were a lot of people who were involved in this war who had been imperialized by the European powers that joined the fight on both sides. And some of them hoped that in doing so, they would be able to get more self-determination, self-rule as a result of this. So World War One is going to be, a lot of it is over issues of nationalism and imperialism. And those are, things that will continue to plague the world after World War One, and we kind of already know that it kind of plays a role into World War Two as well. The Allies, of course, won the war, and the Central Powers was just mainly comprised of Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. End up losing, and in doing so, they are going to end up paying a lot for it through the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And so the Treaty of Versailles is going to end in World War One. It's going to punish Germany, especially for everything that happened, but it also is going to change some of the colonial holdings after World War One. As the Central Powers will lose territory, the Allies will also gain it. And as these colonies had helped, fight for victory of the Allies, they were hoping that they could also get more self-determination, as I mentioned. So let's move on to kind of the first major thing that occurs as far as unresolved tensions of World War One is the mandate system. And so, when the Treaty of Versailles was created, it did break up and take away the territorial holdings of Germany. It broke up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, broke up the Ottoman Empire into different lands. And those lands would be kind of eventually, not all of them, but many of them will fall under the control of the former Allies. So Germany, and we kind of see here in the corner here, that the Empire of Germany had lots of colonial holdings in Central, West, and Southern Africa. And so once these lands were kind of taken away from Germany, there was a hope that some of them, like German East Africa, which is now Tanzania, that they would be able to have self-determination, self-rule. But the Allies themselves didn't see that the same way. And so after the League of Nations was created as part of the Treaty of Versailles, in Article 22, the League of Nations basically, and to paraphrase, it says that colonized people of Africa and Asia and Middle East are too young, is a nice way of putting it, that they need tutelage, they need guidance from more advanced nations of how to govern themselves and so forth. And so this idea, I mean, is something that is continuation of the previous period. We talk about the justification for imperialism to begin with is that, that these people of these faraway places had very different cultures and lifestyles and so forth, which certainly is seen as less advanced. Social Darwinism, scientific racism, these are things that were used to justify why they still needed to be controlled and imperialized by the greater European powers at the time. And so, in order to survive, they basically said, well, we're here to help you and everything. And that justified these. And, things like civilizing missions continue to happen. So that's something that does occur after World War One and the breaking up of some of these empires. Great Britain, France, Japan all increased their territorial holdings as a result. And so rather than these people becoming free after, and once they take them away from the Allies, Central Powers, they just end up in the hands of the Allies. And so many of the German colonies were split between France and Britain. Japan, who also kind of was on the Allied side for a short time, took control of a lot of the German colonies in the Pacific. And that's kind of the beginning of their major imperialistic movements. I would say beginning, but it's right towards the beginning of that. So the Ottoman Empire, which had been around for like 500-600 years, they lose this, and so as a result, much of their lands are going to be broken up. This independent land here was never really truly part of them, but some of this stuff here, this land holdings, Egypt itself was, kind of under the Ottoman sovereignty for a very long time, but still kind of ran its own independent kingdom. If you guys remember Muhammad Ali and his kind of pushback of total Ottoman control and so forth. But much of this land, like Turkey, becomes its independent state, which they had to really fight for. But the rest of them became mandates of the great powers and such. The British mandate of Palestine is one that I definitely want to focus on because of the implications and things that happened during this time period between the wars that definitely have implications of what's going on in the world today. So in 1917, the Balfour Declaration, which was a British declaration that basically said that the Jews of Europe needed a homeland, and Palestine, essentially where Israel and the home of the Jews historically was before the whole diaspora by and the Assyrians and the Roman empires and such dispersed so many Jews throughout Europe and in the Middle East. They wanted to create a homeland for the Jews in Israel, and so as a result, they established this place, a permanent home for the Jews. But Palestinians, ethnically Arab people, were already living there. And so you have this influx of Zionists, people who return into Zion to Israel. That starts to happen more and more between the world wars, especially when we start seeing the Nazis and fascism take control. And in Europe, many Jews, were looking for a place to go. And so many of them will return to Israel. And then, of course, after World War II, it even fluctuates more so. But these Zionist refugees, Zionist migrants, they end up moving to an area and competing with resources for the Palestinians. And of course, the tensions will build and get worse over time between the two peoples as they're competing for the same land. But anyway, the Arabs were not happy generally about, this whole mandate system. It felt like imperialism, which it really was. And in a sense, the British mandate in Mesopotamia essentially becomes Iraq. It's the French mandate of Syria, which, Syria and such. But the reason why so much of this land is wanting to be controlled by the Europeans is the obvious elephant in the room, which would be oil. And so, the resource itself is so valuable. I go back to the idea that they are, thinking how these individuals are just not capable of being able to govern and manage that, without the guidance or tutelage, to paraphrase of Article 22, without the tutelage of the European powers and such. So the Ottoman Empire, this is kind of what happens to them after World War One. And of course, these borders that were created, these superimposed borders and such still generally stand today. This is, modern day Iraq, Syria, Israel. Some of this is going to end up becoming part of Saudi Arabia. But yes, this is all kind of where a lot of the problems in the Middle East begin with is the dividing of these borders, these superimposed borders. Anti-imperialism movement in India, like this is an example of, after World War I, there's going to be people who start to challenge colonization. And one of the biggest and best examples of that would be what happens in India. So the Indian National Congress, an important group to know about, and something that will come up more again in Unit 8, convened in 1885. If you guys remember the 1857 Indian Rebellion, the Sepoy Rebellion, that was put down. The Raj, the British Raj, was created, and so India has much more control over the areas of South Asia, or India, not India. The British have much more stronger control over the South Asia and India through the control of the British Raj. And so, going back to 1885, there was a movement that wanted to gain independence from the British Empire. I mean, India had been its own empires, and for a very long time and such. And so they felt that they needed to be free and independent and to have self-determination. Not to mention that the British, clamped down on a lot of things, forced them to buy things that they didn't need to buy. The British Empire was, they viewed India as the crown jewel of their empire. I mean, it's where they got so many resources. It has so many markets to sell to. That's essentially how it kind of rolled out. But massacre of Amritsar and such in spring of 1919 is a pretty important moment in the movement of the anti-colonialism. So 1919, this is after World War I. And, during World War I, there was a lot of help from Indian soldiers. If I want to go back here, a couple of things. These are Indian soldiers who were fighting on behalf of the British Empire, a lot of them sacrificed just as much as the British did. And so, there was a sense that, that kind of helped deserve some sort of reward, and more self-determination, more sovereignty over their own lands was something they wanted to fight for. So, this is something that needed to be addressed at some point. And so this massacre, where we have Indian nationalists who are protesting for their independence and such, it was generally a peaceful protest and such, and they were ordered to disperse by the British soldiers that were occupying India. They refused to do so. Eventually, they fired into the crowd, and 379 people and more than 1,200 people were wounded as a result of that. And so, for many Indians, this radicalized them, and so they wanted to win it through violent means. But there were also movements that promoted nonviolence, and of course, the big one is Mahatma Gandhi, who I'm sure a lot of people have heard of Gandhi. He's one of the most well-respected individuals in history, in recent history. But he began to advocate for this change through nonviolent non-cooperation. Essentially, we are not going to go along with what the British Raj and the British want us to do. We're going to find a way to become our own self-sufficient, and we're going to break the laws, and we're going to accept the punishments for that. And victimizing themselves, they simply, will gain more followers and more attention seeking, in the British Parliament of what's going on, and hopefully change some minds and hearts. So, a lot of this is in response to after World War I and the violence against civilians and such. So these nonviolent demonstrations, one example is simple as the idea of spinning his own cloth. It's very traditional Diorti. This cloth was spun by him. He made his own clothes and such. And while that kind of is making his own clothes, what big deal? That's not going to make the British want to change. One man, is a big deal. But if you can get more people aboard with this idea, of, it's a lot of symbolism behind it. The reason for that is because the British, had been the textile, leaders in the industrial world for ever since back to like 1770, 1780. They would collect the cotton from India and transport it back to England to turn it into textiles, suits, whatever, and such. And then, of course, they would sell it back to the Indians for marked up prices. And by making their own clothes, it basically cut the British out of that. And so, in history, and if you ever want to make real change, you don't necessarily appeal to people's hearts, you appeal to their wallets. And that's kind of what he's doing here. And so when more and more people get on board with this idea, make your own clothes, it's taken a lot of money out of the British Empire. And of course, that starts to raise eyebrows and turn some heads. Another example, and one of his most famous demonstrations, was the Salt March. So salt's a really important element. I mean, like, the human body needs salt. It needs as much as water, and needs as much as air. And India has plenty of salt, but the British had monopolized it, basically taking control of all of the salt production in India, and then sold it back to the Indians as a high price. The way they got salt was simply to evaporate seawater and such. And so this salt march, where you kind of marched across the country, gathering more and more followers and such. He marched to the sea, and he collects his own salt. I mean, of course, this was illegal, so he was arrested and everything. But again, this kind of brings more attention to the demonstration. Like, here we have something that's essential for life, and the British are monopolizing it, and we should be able to have it. This is our stuff. This can't be owned and sold back to us. So this is something that it definitely leads to more demonstrations. And during World War II, the Indian National Congress is going to basically say, we're not going to fight. We're not going to help the British in World War II, despite the fact that the British were fighting against the Japanese along the borders in what is then Burma, but now Myanmar. And so, that kind of basically non-compliance of India and such, kind of puts the British on edge a little bit and such. But mass acts of civil disobedience, of non-cooperation, non-violence, and such over the course of World War II, and of course immediately after. Eventually, India will gain its independence. The British are going to come to a realization they just cannot put more resources in trying to keep the hold of India. And so, India will end up gaining its independence in 1947, and something we'll talk more in detail about in Unit 8. All right. We also have some major nationalist movements that are going on in East Asia. Korea, the first example here, Korea in 1910 was pretty much imperialized by the Japanese. They had kind of gone in and installed a puppet government, kind of strip them of the resources. And of course, there's a lot of mistreatment of the Korean people. By this time in Japan, the attitudes of Japanese people towards other nations of people, especially in East Asia, was one that the Japanese were far superior. I mean, they had industrialized much faster than Korea, than East Asia, and much of the rest of the East Asian and Southeast Asian regions, I should say. And so they generally mistreated the Korean people. And so there's a growing resentment that occurs over the course of their time in Korea, and the Korean people end up having a march. It's called the March First movement. And I'm not sure why I didn't put the year down, and I'm not exactly sure when the year is. I'll have to look that up, and if you have questions about that, I can get back to you. But there was roughly two of the 17 million people of Korea who end up staging a series of protests against Japanese presence in Korea. This all made the Japanese very kind of nervous about their continuance in Japan. And so they cracked down on it very harshly, arresting people, leaders who were pushing for this thing. But one thing that it does demonstrate is the power of the Korean nationalism, as they are all kind of getting this more sense of unity, of Korean, what it means to be Korean, and that they want to be, have self determination themselves, and they want the Japanese out. China also kind of dealing with a nationalist movement as well. Um, this In China, there was uh, a lot of support for the Allies in World War One. The reason for that is that Germany had lands that were in control in China and such, and they were hoping the defeat of them would be able to reacquire those lands. And this is an area that was highly sought after for the resources that were available there. But after, and I made a typo here and I forgot to fix this. But China hoped to reclaim that land from Germany. But after the war, rather than getting it back, despite the fact that they'd helped the Allies, that land was given to Japan. So it was not given to China, it was given to Japan. And this was pretty insulting, considering that Japan, East Asian country, someone they generally did not get along with, especially when we talk about later in history and what happens when the Japanese invade China. They saw this as a grave insult, and so there's large series of protests that will go. It's called the May 4th movement. So this anti-Japanese, anti-foreign, and European protests that occur in China, and kind of gives this sense of growing Chinese nationalism. And so as a result, the growing Chinese nationalism is important to note, but also important to note is that what that nationalism will look like. And so there's going to be two main factions that break, in this kind of response to what happens after World War One. The Chinese Nationalist Party really kind of had adopted a Western mindset about governments and politics and economics and so forth. But there's a lot of anger towards the Europeans as well. And what they've done as far as imperialism of their country and everything that goes along with that. And so there needs to be, there is going to be a rejection of Westernism in favor of something that ironically comes from the West, is Marxism. And many people in China views Marxism as a rejection of the whole capitalist and system that had come along and imperialized their country for so long. And so we end up creating the Chinese Communist Party as a result too. And these two main factions will be fighting for control of China. Up until the moment where China is invaded by Japan in Manchuria and such, they kind of put the Civil War, the fight for control of China aside to fight the Japanese. And then after World War II, eventually the communists will eventually win the control of the country. The nationalists will flee to Taipei, or most of you know as Taiwan. And that's what ends up happening there. But this is kind of this nationalist movement between the wars definitely have implications for a later time. And then of course Japan, they have a massive nationalist movement. I mentioned before that they kind of view themselves as being superior and such, and they live on this island that has a limited amount of resources, and so they're looking for more resources. They're looking to imperialize for industrialization, just the way that Europeans were looking, prior to World War One as well, even after World War One. But anyway, they are going to take control of some Pacific islands. They took control of some once German-controlled islands, and then they looked to other places. And one place that they saw was Manchuria, China, which was full of natural resources. And the Chinese were generally an easy target for them because they had fallen behind industrialization. And so they invaded China and Manchuria, and they established a puppet state. And that puppet state itself, I'm putting myself on the propaganda. That's weird. Anyway, I'll just move this around. So a Japanese concept, Manchukuo, I know I'm not pronouncing that perfectly, but the Greater East Prosperity Sphere. Japan basically creates this idea, this concept that they want to have a block of East Asian countries, Asian nations that would be culturally, economically unified with Japan. So essentially they would go in and they would create these puppet states in Eastern and Southeastern Asia, under the guidance and tutelage, quote unquote, of the Japanese, and then they would strip them of resources, and then try to change them over time as well to kind of fit into the Japanese mindset, because again, the Japanese saw themselves as superior to all other Asians, and that really was at the part of this. Is that very similar to the ideas of social Darwinism that the Europeans used to justify imperialism, the idea of racial and cultural superiority over the other East Asian countries definitely plays a role in why Japan is going to do this as well. All right. So the last thing to talk about, as far as an example that the College Board wants you to understand as part of the illustrative examples, is what's going on in West Africa, and the resistance to French rule. So Africa, again, they, just like some of these South and East Asian countries, are hoping that some things would change in their benefit after World War One, and many of them were promised that they would get more self-determination, more self-determination, and independence after World War One, because they had helped. And going back to this beginning slide, here are some soldiers from Africa who fought in World War One as well. I do believe that, I think these are Tanzanians, so I think these were soldiers that fought on the side of the Central Powers. But of course, there are soldiers from Africa who fought on the side of the Allied powers as well. So some examples in this one right here, we talk about the resistance to the colonial rule. When they didn't get what they wanted, there were some who basically decided to strike. And so the workers of the railroads went on strike. And that's pretty important to note, because the railroads, which the French had invested lots of money to be able to have this nice railroad system that connected much of French West Africa. And of course, what are they using those railroads for? To get resources. And so when those railroad workers basically stop, well, there's your colonial benefit kind of goes away with it. And so that gets them to pay attention. It doesn't work. And then, after World War II, there's going to be a general strike where basically, a lot of these countries are going to end up organizing these large strikes that basically take away the benefit of having a colony to begin with. There's quite many African intellectuals that are going to be educated in Europe, and by doing so, they kind of begin to recognize that Africa is definitely racially discriminated against by the European powers, and so many of those European educated intellectuals, return home and end up helping negotiate freedom after World War II. Some of them ended up becoming leaders of their countries. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana is an example of one of those individuals, somebody who will definitely come up more so in Unit 8. All right, so that's essentially the PowerPoint presentation, the lecture. And so on Canvas, there is going to be an assignment for you guys to answer these questions. To what extent did the territorial holdings change following World War I? And then identify and explain how the continuity of territorial holdings after World War I led to further tensions. And keep in mind, those tensions do not need to be between the great European powers. It can also mean within their empires as well. Okay. So make sure you answer those questions. And then if you do have any yourself, we'll try to set up some Zoom meetings if I can make it work on my network. And then we'll also be available to answer any questions through Canvas and email. Okay. As well as Reminds. So that's it for me. Hope everyone is safe and healthy, and I will hopefully see you sooner rather than later. The awkward silence.